Hello everyone, and welcome to today's #AgJustice webinar. I am Catherine Nunn, the Outreach Coordinator for the Organization for Competitive Markets, known as OCM. This webinar is an organization for competitive markets membership benefit. First and foremost, thank you all for being members. Today's speakers are the main fair markets researchers, Dr. Hendrickson and Dr. James, both from the University of Missouri. Joe Maxwell, our Executive Director, will introduce them in just a minute. But first, I want to give you a couple tips about this webinar platform. To make it easier for everyone to hear Dr. Hendrickson and Dr. James, we have muted everyone. If you have questions, please hold them till the end of the presentation. If you have immediate technical difficulties during the presentations, please use the comment box to let us know. And that is a little chat symbol on the right of your bar. And then the other thing is, I think, so that people can hear you, if you're on the computer, you have to click your phone icon and choose a way that you want to listen. So thank you everyone for joining, and now I'm going to turn it over to Joe Maxwell, the Executive Director of OCM.
I want to thank everybody for joining, and thank you, Catherine and Angela, for setting this up. But our special guest, we really want to give a great thank you to is Dr. Mary Hendrickson and Dr. Harvey James. Dr. Hendrickson is a longtime friend and advisor to the Organization for Competitive Markets. She is the Associate Professor with tenure at the University of Missouri. Dr. Hendrickson is a rural sociologist. She wants to contribute, as this webinar demonstrates, to a robust discussion among scholars, policymakers, and citizens about the positives and negative implications that everyone faces in the food system as it changes. She focuses her efforts that we greatly appreciate here at OCM on farmers, the rural community, the overall environment, and for the health of all our population. She focuses the social and economic organization of different types of food systems. Dr. Harvey James, her colleague here today, is a professor of applied economics and associate division director and director of graduate studies in the Division of Applied Social Sciences at the University of Missouri, Columbia. Dr. James is editor-in-chief of the Journal of Agriculture and Human Values and focuses his efforts as economics and his other graduate studies on social sciences interplay. So with that, I turn it over to my friends, Dr. Hendrickson and Dr. James.
Well, thank you, Joe.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, we're happy to be here, and we're excited to present the first one of your first webinars, and we'll see how it goes. As we have questions, you'll have it in the chat box, but we're going to spend maybe about 20 minutes, we think, going through this. Hopefully everybody can see our PowerPoints. If you can't, please type it into the chat box, and Catherine will help us make sure that you can see everything. I'm going to start it out, but we're going to go back and forth because
we tag team.
We work together all the time. And really collaborate well on looking at this at agricultural markets. So with that said, can I go? There we go. All right. So the first thing that most of you understand very well is that farmers face a lot of constrained choices in agricultural markets right now. And what we mean is that farmers can't always make the decisions that they might want to make, either on where to buy products, what kinds of products they want to buy, what kinds of commodities they want to produce, because the market, the decisions of farmers are restricted both by the choice options, but also the types of decisions that they can make. And sometimes the structure of the agricultural markets actually forces farmers into kinds of decisions that they may not have otherwise made. So for instance, some farmers may not really be that interested in planting genetically modified seeds. However, the choice in the marketplace, especially around like soybeans, which are about 95% genetically modified at this point, it's kind of an irrelevant choice. There is no choice. It's kind of irrelevant because there's not a choice to plant anything else. And so we're really interested in that. And of course, I've spent a lot of time looking at consolidation in the food system, and this kind of shows you how farmers' choices are constrained. And I want to tell you that all of this data actually came from the Tyson website. So when you look at you know, the percentages and everything, and that's why that 73%, that I'm not sure, I actually believe they're steer and heifer slaughter, but that's what they say. So you can see that it's kind of the same firms, as you all well know, but these markets are very consolidated, and that really impacts the choices that farmers can make. Tyson produces, they say, approximately 20% of the beef, pork, and chicken in the United States. Of course, we've seen in the seed industry, we've seen the big 6 firms become 4 firms. If you haven't been to Phil Howard's website, it's there at the bottom. Please go log on to that. He has some really interesting data up about the seed industry. But if you look at the mergers that have happened, the Dow DuPont that merged and then they spun their companies into 3, including Corteva, Ag Sciences, but Chem China actually bought Syngenta a couple years ago, and then we've seen the Bayer-Monsanto merger that's happened, and they had to sell off some seeds, Bayer did, to BASF. So you can see that what's happening for both domestically and globally, that farmers don't have very much choice when 60% of global proprietary seed sales rest with one firm. And then, of course, Phil's done some work on the global meat markets, and this timeline just kind of shows you the WH Group that owns Smithfield. WH Group, of course, is a Chinese firm that when they wanted to buy Smithfield, they got their loan approved in one day. So it kind of shows you what's happening both domestically and what's happening globally. And we're just looking right now at the, I just presented some information on seeds and protein, but we could go through lots of other kinds of markets. And you all know that. That's not what we're going to talk about today. Today we want to talk about fairness.
So Dr. Hendrickson talked about the context, and as she said, we're all familiar with this. And it's not uncommon for participants in markets and for others to make claims of unfairness. We want to have fair and competitive markets, but some people say it's not fair because small players can't compete against large players or large firms can dominate prices and other conditions, and so we say it's not fair. The challenge that we face, and this is the problem that Dr. Hendrickson and I are very interested in, is how to evaluate these claims of unfairness. And the challenge that we typically face is that when people make claims of unfairness, so the traditional approach is that you evaluate them based on different theories or perspectives of fairness, and so it basically becomes a battle of theories. Different people have different perspectives about fairness. You may pick Rawls or Rosnick or different, your favorite theorists or your favorite perspective. And so these different perspectives are going to have different criteria. They're going to evaluate and make judgments, and it's not helpful because we really can't come to any definitive or objective assessment of whether claims of unfairness are valid or not. So Dr. Hendrickson and I are taking a very different approach. And our approach is based upon the idea of expectations. Expectations matter. Expectations are important because we see them all of us have expectations. We create expectations about how we think others should behave, and government and policy, and our family and colleagues. So we create expectations, but what's important about expectations is that the expectations that we create are not based upon a single theoretical perspective. In fact, usually most of the time we don't even know what perspective that underlies the expectations we create. We have them. We make these expectations. And if you think about claims on fairness, when someone says that's not fair, it almost always occurs because the expectation they have is not met. It's violated. So, for example, Dr. Hendrickson and I are teachers. We may have a student who works really hard in the class, and they may expect to get a really good grade at the end, and if they don't get a good grade, they're going to say that's not fair, because they have an expectation, that expectation is not met. So we use this idea of expectations as the building block for our theory of how we evaluate expectations. And our theory is based upon a number of components. Where our research is based upon trying to understand claims of unfairness that are made in agricultural markets. So we start with an understanding of network structure, and the first thing we do is we want to consider relative dependency. We're not really interested in claims of unfairness made by those who are in positions of power. We're interested in situations where people and producers and others are relatively dependent. And then we simply ask the question, is there a violation of expectations? And then we evaluate. And the idea here is that we would think, we hope that an objective observer can make some intelligent observation about the expectation, whether those expectations are reasonable or not. And so our theory, we identify various criteria that might be helpful for us to determine whether expectations that people have are reasonable or not. So a couple here that you see that seem reasonable. One is called equal treatment of equals. The other is time consistency. The idea behind equal treatment of equals is that if we have individuals who perceive themselves, or one individual that perceives him or herself as equal to another, and they are treated differently, it will not be surprising for that person to raise a claim of unfairness. So, for instance, we see this in the workplace. If you have a female worker who has the same education and work experience and skills as a male colleague, and the male colleague has a higher pay, then it would not be surprising for the female worker to say that's not fair because of the perceived equality there.
And I want to jump in right here, because one of the things that we did look at was we looked at the poultry, what poultry farmers said during the 2010 Department of Justice and Ag, Departments of Justice and Ag, their competition hearing, and we looked at this, and a lot of the claims of that people are saying, well, it's not fair, was like, I'm the same poultry farmer, I have the same birds, I have everything the same, and I don't get treated the same. And so we really focused in on that. We see this in other arenas as well, with pigs or with crops, but you can really see it right there in the poultry arena. That's one place. These folks are structurally equivalent, equal treatment of equals. Yeah,
and what's helpful about this is that an objective observer can look at the situation and say, yeah, you are equals and you're not treated equally. Your claim of unfairness is reasonable. Or conversely, an objective observer may look at the situation and say, you're not equal. and there are good reasons to show that you're not equal. Therefore, your claim of unfairness based upon your perceived violation of expectation is not reasonable. So equal treatment of equals is one thing. Time consistency is another. If you've been treated the same way over and over and over for a long period of time, and all of a sudden you're treated differently, you may have an expectation of consistent treatment, and that's different. You say, oh, that's not fair. And a really good example of this is with seeds. Farmers for generations have saved seeds and replanted them the next year, and then you have a situation where a company says, well, no, you can't do that anymore. And so that violation of time consistency, change in consistency is something that might be a basis for a reasonable expectation.
And then we have these ideas about how markets should operate. And so we often think that, if you're entering into the marketplace, that you have some freedom to negotiate and dictate terms, that you're entering into the marketplace to profit, so you should have freedom to profit from exchange. That, a basic idea of our competitive markets is to know and be informed about what's happening in the marketplace. Again, the freedom to be treated equally, so there's not bias in the marketplace. And then this one is really important, is that you have the freedom to make ethical decisions. And this goes back to our idea about constrained choice, that sometimes farmers aren't always able to make the choices they would like to make about how they're treating animals or workers or ecology. So these are another arena. An objective observer says this is the way markets are supposed to work.
And it's not, we don't think it's, or I should say, it's not unrealistic for people participating in the market to have expectations about each of these things. And when they're participating in the market and they are unable to come close to making profits because of market conditions or consolidations or whatever, or when information is being constrained and they're not able to get information they needed. If these expectations are not met or they're violated, it's not surprising to us that we're going to see people making claims of unfairness. But what our work is doing here is we find this effective because it is a theory independent approach. We don't have to rely on a particular theoretical perspective, and we think that, as we said, an objective observer should be able to make at least some reasonable observation about what's going on. And so, what does all this mean? Well, our theory, our perspective, we think has implications for two things, and one is understanding markets. The other is policy. I'll comment briefly about markets, and then Dr. Hendrickson can say something about policy. Our particular perspective allows a very strong consideration of fairness now, particularly in the context of efficiency. Economists, I'm a trained economist. Dr. Hendrickson had her undergraduate degree in economics, and so we hear the efficiency argument a lot. Consolidation is supposed to be efficient and good for society, and that's a hard argument to refute unless you have something concrete to go against that. And our perspective now provides a way of raising some counter arguments to the efficiency argument for consolidation or whatever else, because now we have a basis for evaluating claims of unfairness.
And then, so this has policy implications, quite a few policy implications. So one of the things that I remember very clearly is David Domina. Many of you know him. He's a lawyer that worked on the Pickett versus IBP, Pickett versus Tyson case. And at the OCM conference in 2009, he said that we need new policy considerations in antitrust because of the way that things have been interpreted in the legal arena. And so we feel like that we're trying to provide a kind of new framework for how you could think about new policies around competition or antitrust that would help us regulate the market better, or to help us think about expectations, and so that those expectations can be met in the marketplace. So in the terms of antitrust policy, but also there's a lot of interest, I think, in this in the contract arena. So, for instance, the Ag Justice Project that a number of organizations are collaborating on that certifies that a product's been grown by an Ag Justice farmer talks a lot about transparency, which is the freedom to know and be informed. It talks a lot about being able to negotiate and dictate terms. We see that in the agriculture in the middle, where we think about values-based value chains and how we can negotiate within that value chain. So we think that there's application for this in contract law as well. And sometimes maybe competition policy isn't just antitrust, but it's all kinds of policies that govern market transactions. And so we're still working on this. This is by no means a finished product. Doing things like this, the questions, we're looking forward to your questions, because that's going to help us think about this a little bit better. We do know that that our ideas are making sense to some lawyers, but they want us to refine them, so we're working on that. But anyway, we're going to stop there and open it up to questions. I will give you hopefully I'm going to give you there you go. That's how you can get into contact with us. We're both pretty responsive on email. Probably Dr. James is a little bit better than me, but please feel free to reach out to us too. So, Catherine, we'll turn it back to you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Dr. Hendrickson and Dr. James, for this really insightful presentation. And I do want to open up the conversation for questions. And so you should all now be able to ask questions.
I have a question. I'll start. This is Joe Maxwell. I want to thank you all for this work, because as OCM and many organizations, several on this phone call, we're constantly trying to argue about or have conversation about the value to the market of fairness. And you all are finally beginning, for the first time I'm aware, anybody's really putting down kind of a stake in the ground to say that it matters. And two, if it matters, then how in the world do you measure it so then we can more objectively have that conversation for policy or for litigation? Does the premise, though, start with an expectation that the marketplace should be fair? Is that an assumed starting point? Or how does that work? I always say it should be fair, but I mean, is that an expectation that I have, and is that monitored, or is that a given? Oh, one moment, Dr. James. We're waiting to hear you.
Okay, can you hear us?
Can you hear us?
Thank you.
Can you hear us okay now?
I can, yes.
Perfect.
Okay, very good. So let me reframe the question slightly. Is it appropriate to think that markets should be competitive? What expectations should we have? In our framework, if an expectation is met, we can say it's fair. If it's not met, we say it's unfair. And so the question, I think that really what you're trying to get at is, what is the appropriate expectation we should have about markets? And Mary and I have actually had this conversation not too long ago about this. Is it reasonable to expect that markets should be competitive? And probably yes. Why? Well, one reason is that's what we teach in school. I teach economics, and In economics, we say the markets work best when they are competitive, when buyers and sellers are free to enter and exit and negotiate, and the 5 freedoms that we put up there. And so, if we're teaching that, then the expectation seems reasonable. If it was not a reasonable expectation, then the question is, why are we teaching that markets should be competitive? So, does that answer your question?
And we can't hear you, Joe. I would just tag on to that just a second, is that that what we saw in reading through the transcripts is that lots of times people equate fair and competitive. And as Harvey just said, what you have to understand is it a reasonable expectation for the market to be competitive? Then you can say fair or unfair. So you really don't talk about the market itself as fair.
Yeah. The way you should, at least from our perspective, is you ask what is the expectation that we should have, and then are conditions consistent with what we expect them to be, and then we draw the conclusion about whether it's fair or not.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. I oftentimes say that in my debates on the Hill and elsewhere, and I'm just trying to understand how I can frame it correctly, so then this data and this research can then be applied to my case that I'm trying to make. So thank you.
Good.
Yeah.
And Vaughn, I think, had a question.
This is Vaughn. My question would be then, in the judicial setting, do they start with the analysis of unfair as being comparable to illegal, when you bring something before them?
That's a good question. Again, I suppose we would say, what is the expectation? And so, I guess the obvious expectation is that things should be legal. And if something is expected to be legal and it's not legal, then people would say not only is it illegal, but it's not fair. So again, what is our initial expectation?
And I think, Vaughn, the question, this is a really interesting question. And we may not be far enough along right now in our thinking. And this is actually what Peter Carstensen had some critique, a really robust critique of one of our articles, and it was great because it's like, oh yeah, we need to think about that a little bit more. But if it is like in part of contract law that these notions of, like say the 5 freedoms are part of that contract law, then a claim of unfairness would violate the law. But you also have to remember, Vaughn, that you're talking to an economist and a sociologist, and Joe is the lawyer. So, because sometimes, and this is one thing that we still need to work out a little bit, because I think lawyers are interested in this work from the litigating side, and there may be some possibilities right now to potentially look at what we're talking about and litigate, but we don't understand that side of it. We don't know the law per se, so that's probably not the best question for us. But as somebody like Peter or Joe, those questions are better asked. But that gives us something to think about, and it's a really interesting question.
Let me also add by pushing back the perspective. Why do we have laws? For instance, why do we have antitrust law? A historian will go back and can look at the context of an antitrust law. If we're using antitrust law as an example of the broader legal context in question, why do we have antitrust law? I think the original intent was a perception that the way things were going at the time were not fair, that participants in the market were not able to do what they wanted to do because of the trusts and so forth. And so So the original intent was to make markets more competitive. And so I guess the question is, is current antitrust law consistent with what we expect it to do? Are the expectations that we have about current antitrust law reasonable? In other words, maybe they should change or maybe not. Maybe the original intent of antitrust law is what it should be. And if antitrust law is changed and we expect, and those expectations we have are reasonable because they should be what the original intent was, then we can say the existing situation is not fair because current law is not consistent with our expectations. So, the legal issue is really interesting, and this is something that Mary and I need to think more about. But from my perspective, I would want to go back and say what is it the law really intends to do, and what expectations do laws create? Are they reasonable expectations? And then, is it doing what it should do? Are expectations met, or are they being violated?
And Catherine, you can cut me off any time here if we've got more questions, but that just sparked an idea for me, and that right now current antitrust is framed as this, is the consumer welfare enhanced through low prices. That's the way it's been reinterpreted through the judiciary, although Peter Carstensen would tell me I'm not totally right on that, but still, that's the general trend. And that's a great question. Was that really the original intent? Because a lot of us think that that's really not fair. It's not fair to producers. It's not fair to communities. It's not fair to the environment. And so, maybe going back and looking at that,
looking at the intention and what expectations we created, and whether those expectations need to be revised or whether they should remain.
Nice question, though.
Thank you.
And I think what I'm going to do now, just to help everyone with the technology, is I am going to unmute everyone for a bit, so that people that didn't figure out how to ask a question can go ahead and try.
What?
There you go. So if anyone else has a question, now's the moment to ask it.
Yeah, Catherine, I have a question. Catherine, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, this is Judy Heffernan. There are people on this call that know much more about the Pickett case than I do. I think some of them were even plaintiffs. But if I remember, the final outcome of that case, I think, gets at part of what you were just responding to with Vaughn. If I remember correctly, the jury came back and said, yes, the plaintiffs had been abused, my word, not the legal term, and they deserved compensation for what they'd gone through, and the judge came back and overruled and said, well, yeah, that may be true, but, quote, something like, this is how business is done nowadays. And I'm thinking in terms of your fairness issue, take that out, and somebody that's on knows more about the case. Correct me if I'm wrong. That was a summary from long ago.
So that's a really interesting question, Judy, and we just both looked at each other and said, "Whoa."
Okay, I'm making some notes here. There might be another paper here.
So one of the things that Dr. James and I have actually debated quite a bit is sometimes in terms of these expectations, right, the system, the structure has beaten people down so badly, right? So that the existing structure where they're relatively dependent, relatively powerless within this agricultural structure of agricultural markets, that their expectations are no longer they expect it to be treated badly, essentially,
and
right?
So there is no violation of expectations, and so they're not going to say it's unfair because they don't think their voice is going to be heard. And that's a great question. And as Mary said, she and I have talked about this, and I think one of the benefits of our perspective is that issue can be addressed. In other words, we go back to the objective observer. And the objective observer can look at the situation and say, your expectations are not reasonable. They're too low. Instead of saying, your expectations are too high, you need to temper them a little bit, an objective observer can say, they're actually too low, or they're not what they could be. You are the same as somebody else. You have been treated unequally. And if you had more reasonable expectations, then you could say, my treatment is not fair. And so there's some power in thinking about expectations and adding this objective observer idea. Can objective observer look at the situation and say something intelligent about the expectations that people have? And again, it goes both ways. You can say they're unreasonable because they're too high, or they're unreasonable because they're not high as they could be.
And the jurors should have been objective observers.
Sure. That's
the point. Yeah. And so in this case, a reasonable observer may conclude that the judge acted inappropriately, for instance. But we're not the legal scholars here, right? But that is really interesting. It makes us think.
You have 12 objective observers. They make an assessment that someone was not treated fairly, and then you have one who says no. Which provides the better assessment of expectations? That actually is a fascinating question.
And is the business as usual, like, okay, so it might be unfair, but it's just business as usual, goes back to the original thing about getting beaten down. So that's really kind of an interesting question.
This is Joe Maxwell. My takeaway from that point, Dr. Hendrickson and Judy, is, as someone that works in advocacy, like a lot of the people on the call webinar today and will be attending our conference, we may want to think about having, calling out unfairness as not being reasonable, or to frame it that you have a right in the marketplace to be treated fairly. To help establish a benchmark or a bench line that folks don't slowly. I hear it all the time. Well, that's just the way it is now. Yeah. Farmers and ranchers say that. Well, Joe, that's just the way it is now. I always say, is that what you want it to be? Well, no, but that's just the way it is. So.
And Joe, that goes back to that basic liberties, because what's interesting about those basic liberties are. We frame those as liberties and not rights, because a right, of course, implies
a duty and
duty. So we frame those as liberties.
Okay.
To actually say that these are expectations or freedom. This is the expectations of how a market should work, and those were informed by the way we teach economics and the way we original competition law and things like that. So that might be really interesting for you to think about in terms of like framing your advocacy.
Going back to something we talked about previously, what criteria can be used to evaluate expectations? Rights can be a very effective criteria. I have an expectation of treatment because of rights I have or perceived duties that others have, and if others have particular duties and I am, they're not following them, I have an expectation they do. I can say that's not fair. So rights and duties are something that it can absolutely be a basis for establishing expectations and doing evaluation of expectations. It's not a direction that we've gone yet. It's certainly something we could, but as Dr. Hendrickson said, we found at least those 5 freedoms. We found it helpful to discuss them in terms of liberties and freedoms, instead of rights. But actually, it's a good question.
Any other questions?
Are we too esoteric for all of you?
I guess what should they expect from us?
Yes.
What should you expect from a couple of academics?
Well, if there's no more questions, I think I want to thank Dr. Hendrickson and Dr. James again for taking the time to have this great discussion and presentation with us. And we hope to see everyone next time on our next webinar.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.